General. This is Mike Wheeler. We're here at the Marks Center Alexandria campus of the Institute for Defense Analyses to continue our discussion of nuclear history and your observations on it. We talked a lot about the latter part of the Cold War and after the Cold War in earlier sessions. Today I think we'll cycle back to the beginning, basically. And so to kind of set the stage, again, you were born in 1934. 2 years before you were born, James Chadwick, working in a laboratory in Britain, discovered the neutron. And there was an explosion of kind of physical discoveries that then went on until a laboratory in Germany discovered nuclear fission process in 1938. That led basically to the concern in the United States that Germany was attempting to develop the atomic bomb. We had the Manhattan Project put in place. And by 1945, the Manhattan Project had produced an atomic bomb. The United States, with its British and Canadian allies, conducted the first test in the deserts of New Mexico. That was in July 1945. And then in early August, we used the bomb first on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki. You were 11 years old at the time. Yeah. It's opportune we're talking about this right now. A couple weeks ago, the United States President, President Barack Obama, became the first president, sitting president, to actually visit Hiroshima. So we'll kind of cycle back on that. Let me begin by asking you, as an 11-year-old, what did you remember when the bomb was dropped?
Well, I didn't remember a lot. I recall walking to school with my older sister, probably in 1941, 1942. Mm-hmm. And she was singing a song, Remember Pearl Harbor. And I asked her, what is Pearl Harbor? See, the point is, and she explained it, the point is that, that I had uncles that were serving, and we had the star on the door. So I think I, like most people my age at that time, were very aware of the conflict. We were not aware of nuclear weapons. It just wasn't. I think that the awareness of the impact of nuclear weapons probably struck most of us probably in the early 50s. Because from about the early 50s, for a number of years, there was the real, we considered the real possibility of nuclear war. And there were preparations for nuclear war. Most of them would have been useless. Nonetheless, it was a way that people began to gain awareness of this. You know, regarding the decisions in 1945, I guess my most reliable information doesn't come from the many histories. It comes from somebody who was at the scene when President Truman made the decision, and that was General Andrew Goodpaster. And General Goodpaster relates both the atmosphere and the general dynamics in that room because he was very much a part of it. And it was very clear to him that President Truman, who was well known for making hard decisions, that President Truman made the decision on a very simple basis. And that was the potential loss of life, both to the Allies and to the Japanese, was much greater with the possibility of an invasion than what was expected from the use of the two nuclear weapons. And again, while there's some revisionist history, I take my cue from General Goodpaster, and his view was it was no more complex than that. There were two choices. Plan for a major invasion, the likes of which we had never seen, or use these two weapons with the probability that that would end the war.
One of the things that that reinforces General Goodpaster's observations to you is the way the war then ended.
Yeah.
Well, we know that the Japanese cabinet was divided, that there was a large faction that would have preferred national suicide over surrender. We know that the emperor was treated as a godlike figure in Japan. He had never appeared in public. He had never been on the radio before. And within days of Nagasaki, he did go on the radio and basically called on Japanese troops to be loyal to him, the Japanese government to be loyal to him, to lay down their arms and to surrender unconditionally. It's hard to argue with that particular fact on how the war ended, because we know that the Japanese were very tenacious fighters. In fact, there were islands in the Pacific still where years after the end of the war, you had former Japanese troops that were hiding out, that either had not gotten the word or simply refused to surrender, who were armed and dangerous. But at any rate, we know that happened and the war ended. The other thing, and this will kind of bring us forward to talking about what then happened in the early 1950s, is we had a strategic bombing campaign that had been going on for a long time against Japan. We had a submarine campaign to interdict any food supplies or things coming into Japan that had been going on for a long time. They suffered a great deal of damage from those campaigns. And some revisionist historians argue if you had simply continued those campaigns long enough, they would have surrendered. But again, the key was the emperor intervening and how they surrendered. There certainly was something about the shock of nuclear weapons, and that shock effect is what gets carried forward as we begin to talk about the developments of deterrence theory.
Well, I think you only have to look at the words that the emperor used. But, you know, again, it's easy to look back and imagine something or try to imagine what might have happened. But I think then we had to make our judgments based on what we had experienced. And what we had experienced, particularly with the Japanese fighting man, that they considered it absolutely dishonorable to surrender. They chose death over becoming POWs. That they expected us to do the same. The suicide attacks on our naval forces, the horrendous damage done by the firebomb raids on Tokyo and other Japanese cities that created far more damage than either nuclear attack. So we had observed the Japanese response to all of those conditions, and there was absolutely no indication that they were considering surrender. So I think President Truman had to take the position that we would have to invade and that the Japanese would fight to the last child, and that it would be a really bloody, difficult invasion. So I think what we would have to conclude at that time, the Japanese simply will not surrender to American forces. They simply will not surrender to anything like they had experienced in the past. But the nuclear weapon was very different. While the emperor was godlike, so was the nuclear weapon. And in fact, that's what he said. You know, he said this new and terrible power, I'm paraphrasing, that has never been experienced before. And now we cannot resist it. So I think it's very clear that it was that weapon that allowed the emperor to bypass all of these centuries of tradition and save his nation. So I know that the nuclear abolitionists would have great difficulty with this. I believe that President Truman's decision saved Japan. I have no idea how Japan would have recovered from a successful actual invasion.